Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Reed Tuckson, and I am privileged to be the co-founder of the Black Coalition Against COVID and a partner with blackdoctor.org. And we welcome you to this COVID worldwide town hall. For over 20 months now, we've been engaged in a worldwide battle against COVID-19. This pandemic has been fought with the aid of an increasing evolution of knowledge, tools, and competencies, some of which represent extraordinary breakthroughs in human scientific achievement and innovation. We have progressed from fighting with a truly impressive worldwide surveillance capability with masks, hand and surface hygiene, physical distancing, and quarantine. And now we're fighting with effective and safe vaccines, monoclonal antibodies, and maybe soon even with oral antivirals. Unfortunately, the COVID virus has also continually progress with an evolving pattern of dangerous mutations. And unfortunately, availability of vaccines remains unfairly and inequitably distributed throughout the world, leaving tens of millions of human beings unable to receive the life-saving protections that vaccines provide. And unfortunately, vaccine misinformation, conspiracy theories, hesitancy, and rejection have also progressed to an extent that our world's ability to save lives and stomp this pandemic out has become severely compromised. One thing we have learned without any dispute is that we're all in this together. Regardless of what country you live in, what city you live in, what community you live in, what family you live with, we are all in this together. The good news is this reality is that we can learn from each other. We have all lessons that we can share, pitfalls to avoid, ideas to incorporate and shape into our own cultures and capabilities. That's what we're here for today, to help us to learn. We've assembled an outstanding international panel of healthcare professionals, epidemiologists, virologists, researchers, and practitioners. They will share what is working and not working in their countries as they fight against COVID-19 and continue to evolve that fight. We will learn about challenges such as vaccine hesitancy and its causes, vaccine access and related health system infrastructure problems, and we will talk about solutions. So welcome on behalf of our sponsors and particularly Amgen, the highly innovative therapeutics company, along with the Black Coalition Against COVID and blackdoctor.org. So let's get right to it. And to do that, let me bring in two very special leadoff panelists, Dr. Keith Crawford and Dr. Marion Vermeulen. They will help us to understand what's happening in South Africa. Dr. Crawford has over 25 years of experience in the treatment of chronic infectious diseases and doing and conducting clinical research. He distinguished himself through his work with the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, the largest global network for HIV research. And he also was a leader in the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, what we always have come to learn as PEPFAR. When he was with the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and during that time worked with 4 African nations. Currently, he is with the NIH, even though his thoughts today will be his own. Dr. Vermeulen is a leader at the Transfusion Medicine and Technical Services Organization at the South African National Blood Service. Her current role there consists of the development of the blood services strategy for the testing, processing, issuing, transportation, and logistics of over 1 million donations a year. She is also the principal investigator for the Protect COVID-19 convalescent plasma donor and anti-COVID virus serial prevalence studies. We're really pleased to have you both, Dr. Crawford and Dr. Vermeulen, with us. And maybe we can start with you, Dr. Crawford. If you could help you and Dr. Vermeulen to summarize the extent of the research that you are learning from South Africa and how it pertains to giving the whole world new knowledge about fighting this coronavirus. Take it away, Dr. Crawford.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Tuxton. It's quite an honor, a privilege to be introduced by someone who has such a long track record of service in our community. So thank you for that. I am just delighted to have my colleague, Dr. Marion Vermeulen, on, who's going to be talking about some of the work that she's been doing in South Africa. And I've had the great privilege to work with Dr. Vermeulen on some projects that we're trying to understand the immune response to COVID-19, the different variants and the effects of of vaccines and protections. We're trying to understand that. And we also understand we have to work together globally. And so that's exactly what we are doing through our collaboration with South Africa and some other countries as well. But Dr. Vermeulen has agreed to share some of her experiences and some of her research. She's the principal investigator of a major research study in South Africa. And I want to start by asking her, Dr. Vermeulen, when did you realize in South Africa that you had a problem with this COVID-19 pandemic?
Oh, good evening or good morning or whatever the time is where whoever's listening. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on this, and thanks so much to blackdoctors.org. I think we realized pretty quickly that we were. I think in the very, very beginning, we sort of thought that this was a European and Chinese issue, and it wasn't really a problem at all in South Africa. And then it hit, I think, around about the 5th of March, I think it was, in 2020. But very quickly we realized, well, this is global, it's happening everywhere, and no one's going to escape from it. But I think the second wave for us was probably the wave that really brought it home when we identified the beta variant in South Africa, and how the mutations had come about quite quickly, and all of a sudden realizing. It was, in fact, in that process that we realized that the convalescent plasma study we had been doing, which was a clinical trial, was showing that the antibodies to the ancestral virus, if you like, didn't, or the wild type, didn't actually work so well against the beta virus. And I think that's when we realized in South Africa that we have a problem as well.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And we're going to come back to that study and talk a little bit more about it. And later we'll be posting a site to the YouTube interview where Dr. Vermeulen and her colleague, Dr. Vandenberg, present their actual research. This is Dr. Karen Vandenberg, who works closely with Dr. Vermeulen. And they actually did an interview where they presented the results, the outcomes of their study. You have an opportunity to go to this site and actually learn how they conducted their study. It's really top-notch, high-quality research. We'll come back to that. Next question I wanted to ask is, who is most affected in South Africa? Who are the most vulnerable? South Africa is very different from the United States. You don't have as many of the high-risk populations, the obesity, the diabetes, the chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, some of the things that increase our risk for serious outcomes from COVID-19. Your population demographics are also different from ours, where in the US we have populations of colors, minority populations, African American, Latino, indigenous populations being heavily infected. Tell us a little bit about what the pandemic looks like in South Africa. Who is affected the most, and how you all are trying to help those populations most affected?
So it's a number of questions in there. So we did a seroprevalence study, and that's one of the studies that you mentioned that's on that YouTube link. But that study was performed so we could really try and see how many people had actually been exposed to COVID-19 or to the virus SARS-CoV-2, because the cases that were being reported, in other words, people who had gone to go and get a test done to see whether they actually had COVID or not, is very different to actually the number of people who had been infected. And so in that study, we actually showed that very little difference between age groups and very little difference between gender as to the number of people who had been exposed and had contracted the virus. But huge differences by province and by race group. So we saw many more people in the Black population having been exposed to having had the virus. In fact, as high as around, at the time, this was in May, of around about 63% of the population, compared to about 15% of white people, for example's sake. And this makes sense because we are a country with a lot of poverty, as you know, and so a lot of people living in very, very, very close quarters. So although the country put in rules, for example, of lockdown and social distancing, that's actually not possible in many, many areas in our country. And so from a point of view of who was exposed, without a doubt, the majority of the people were in the Black population. However, what's quite interesting is that's not the people who were presenting in hospital. So they weren't necessarily so vulnerable and had very mild infections. And part of that study that we did, we actually contacted the people who tested positive, as well as a group of people who tested negative, and we asked them about symptoms that they'd had, and whether they'd had symptoms, whether they'd been diagnosed, whether they'd gone to go and get tested or anything like that. And the conversations are actually so interesting because the donors were like, no, what are you talking about? There's no ways I could have had COVID. I didn't have any symptoms. I didn't feel sick at all. And yet they definitely had. So we then were able to determine in that study that about 50% of the people had no symptoms whatsoever. And then another large proportion had maybe like a runny nose, but nothing major, nothing to warrant that they actually went and got tested. On the other side, of course, there is also access to healthcare. And it's expensive to go and have a test done. So, if you've got a runny nose, but a little bit of flu symptoms, but you don't feel terribly ill, you're also not going to go and spend the huge amount of money for a PCR test that you actually can't afford. So definitely, I think a lot of people in the country didn't actually access healthcare. And we found overall in our study about a 13-fold difference between the number of people who actually tested positive according to case reports compared to what we saw with people who had antibodies. So in other words, had been exposed at some point.
Great, thank you. One question that I think everybody wants to know about is the Omicron variant. And you all, first of all, have an excellent surveillance system for looking at possible new variants that could pop up. It's really a great system. And you all courageously reported to the world when this new variant appeared. Now, unfortunately, there were some pretty unfortunate consequences for you all, basically alerting the world that Omicron was on the way. Why don't you share some of the things that you may have learned about Omicron since the time it's been emerged, and since we've had a little bit of time to kind of see, how do people do in the hospitals, protection of the vaccines, other issues that you might want to report on?
Okay, so I'm definitely not an expert here at all, and there's been a lot of research done by colleagues in various other institutions, not actually by the South African National Blood Service. But I am on a number of the groups that discuss the research, and so I will give the information that I know at the moment. So the first thing I think is, because of the HIV pandemic that we have, and because of TB, we have excellent, as you said, we have excellent surveillance systems. We do a lot of sequencing, and we have many laboratories around the country that perform that sequencing. And so when COVID came along, they were very quickly able to convert that sequencing to doing sequencing of the virus of COVID as well. And so all the way along, the labs have been taking a sort of sample of the positive cases and testing them, performing the full sequence on them. And that is why they discovered the beta variant, and also now why they discovered Omicron. Actually, with Omicron, a little bit more interesting is it was actually discovered by one of our private laboratories, private pathology laboratories in Johannesburg, because they were using the TACPath test, which has on the S gene has a dropout. So in other words, it wasn't actually detecting, because of the mutations, didn't detect that gene. So they were having positives on the other genes, but not on that gene, and which looked strange. And that's when they alerted people to doing the sequence and actually realized that we had this new variant of concern. So then they very quickly, the scientists very quickly wanted to tell the world, and yes, it backfired terribly. We were red listed. Our tourist industry took quite a bit of a dive, but hopefully, I think a lot of people, they have removed those restrictions and people are coming back into the country.
And one of the good things, Dr. Vermeulen, as we close out this section, has been very important while you took in the hit, has been an enormous amount of respect for the scientific acumen and the diligence of the South African science community. There are a lot of people who are singing your praises every day. And so while there were some downsides for it, we just want you to know that the rest of the world is cheering on you, appreciating you and your colleagues for what you've done. And I think South Africa has really emerged into the light of positivism in the appreciation of the world. So thank you very much for joining us, you and Dr. Crawford. And I hope you'll be able to stay around for the 10-minute lightning round at the end of the show. We really very much appreciate hearing from you. And now it is my great pleasure to bring into the conversation Dr. Margaret Larkins Pettigrew. By the way, there is this, they'll put a little note on where you can go to see that YouTube video that has been referenced several times in that previous conversation. And so you can find that on blackdoctor.org's YouTube page. But I'm glad to bring in Margaret Larkins Pettigrew, who is Senior Vice President, Chief Clinical Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, and Professor of OBGYN at Allegheny Health Network and Highmark Health. She is a professor and the author of the book, Colors of My Heart, Embracing My Blackness Through History, Family, Fear, and Faith. She's worked all over the world, including South Africa, Ghana, and Guyana. Welcome, Dr. Larkins Pettigrew. And as we start off, help us to look around the world from your perspective. What toll are you seeing COVID taking on populations, hospitals, and healthcare workers in the countries that you're studying?
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Tuckson. It's a pleasure to be with so many experts today talking about this important topic. So as the Chief Clinical Diversity Officer at Highmark, of course, we've been very, very much involved in what's coming into our systems, our community, and taking care of our COVID infected individuals. We are really being hit very hard again. Our hospital beds are full, our emergency rooms are full. We're seeing more young folks coming in who have not been vaccinated. Those who have been vaccinated and have had boosters are not coming in very ill at all. And so what we're seeing is what we saw, months ago, where our beds are occupied, our young people are being intubated, and I see this as a legacy. We need to think about taking care of our legacies because we're losing many of our young folks to this virus. But I look at this on a larger perspective because I have worked both, nationally, internationally, and of course continue to do that. And I've seen, of course, the large gaps in disparities in healthcare since the COVID, more so than since the outbreak. We have always lived in a time where there's been significant health disparities and other issues as well. But this is just another tipping point that we have to take advantage of. We've had multiple tipping points around how we deal with these disparities in healthcare, disparities in how we are treated as far as people of color, in the world, because it hasn't changed. As a person who's worked in many of the places you mentioned and still work in Guyana, people of color are still not treated very well, no matter where we go. And this lack of dignity, respect in a hospital system kills. It continues to kill at the bedside as people make decisions based on attitudes that they may have gathered from their historical growth and lived experiences. So it's a responsibility of all of us, as Malcolm X said when he was working with Martin Luther King, to really think about health disparities. And he said, when I becomes we, then illness becomes wellness, which is so true because we can't do this alone. We see that more so because we're in the midst of all of the people around us who may be infected, reinfected. We've seen death, especially as a health provider, working and taking care of people living with HIVs, women living with HIV. And it is really time that we use this opportunity and not lose this opportunity to really make things right as we move forward.
That's an excellent point. Let me ask you the lived experience and compare maybe the United States from Guyana, where you've been working as well. In the United States, we have such a history of racism. We point so often, so many of our people point to the Tuskegee syphilis study as a kind of an example of why the distrust. Are those same factors that similarly expressed in other countries, or are they different?
They don't talk about the Tuskegee experience, but they talk about experiences they had as well, working in Swaziland, where you were really mistreated just because of you were in poverty, and how we even dealt with the HIV epidemic. And many of our previous speakers could address this as well. Is that nothing was available for testing. So people took care of their parents at home dying, and we're talking about children who took care of their parents at home dying. So it really is around poverty. It's really around class and how we conduct ourselves throughout the world. This issue of humility is missing. It is significantly absent from what we want to do for everyone and should do for everyone in the world.
Good. Let me ask you one really fast question before we run out of time. Is one of the things we see around the world, and this is particularly germane for your specialty, is women being concerned about vaccines because of the fertility concerns, particularly the misinformation that's spreading around. Can you very succinctly let us understand, is there a real fear of fertility misadventures with the vaccines that are currently available to the world's population?
The fear may be real, but the issue around fertility is that the vaccine does not affect the fertility. It doesn't affect sperm, doesn't affect ovaries. It's very safe for women. In fact, we recommend that they take it because their immune systems are suppressed. So yes, they need to have the vaccine, because if they get ill, if they're ill without that vaccine, they're going to be sicker and they're going to die. So they need to take the vaccine. It is very safe for women who are planning to get pregnant, who are pregnant, and women who are breastfeeding. So trust the science. It is absolutely good for women to do it.
Trust the science. That's the key thing. Thank you so much, Dr. Larkins-Pettigrew. We're very pleased, and hopefully you'll be able to join us at the end of the show for our lightning round of questions. It is now our great joy to move to Ghana, because we get a chance now to hear from Dr. Terrell Sanders. Dr. Sanders is a dual-boarded physician in internal medicine and in infectious diseases. Located in Accra, Ghana, he's also a trailblazer in the field of global medicine for the United States Navy. Dr. Sanders, please help us to understand there in Ghana, what's going on? What's the toll that COVID is taking in Ghana?
So thank you, Dr. Tuckson. Can y'all hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So similar to Dr. Pettigrew and a lot of the perspective in South Africa, it kind of took everybody by shock. Fortunately, in Ghana, we were prepared even before we saw our first few cases. The interagency health teams here with the Ghana Health Services and Ministry of Health, as soon as we started to see cases in Wuhan, China, were already kind of preemptively preparing with a lot of the surveillance systems that they kind of had in place already. And so we knew that, the borders are open, this may not be contained. So we need to make sure that we have the capacity and capabilities to test for this if it does encroach in Ghana. And so when the first few cases hit on March 12th, we were ready. We were testing as early as mid-February, and then even doing retrospective sampling to see had cases kind of gotten into the country before we even heard about what COVID was. One of the, I think, most unique things that I've seen, just the aspect of the pandemic here, is just the stigma kind of surrounding COVID. Similar to, as an infectious disease specialist, I've seen similar stigma with HIV. And so to have a respiratory infection that kind of invokes and elicits that much fear and stigma and shame, definitely impacted the strategy and approach to how you manage to treat this, because a lot of people just weren't showing up to hospitals when they got sick, and then continuing to spread and propagate the disease in the community because nobody wanted to be labeled as having COVID or Coro. So early on in the pandemic, and it's gotten much better now, but early on, that was one of the most interesting takes that I'm like, wow, it's similar to the flu. It's not HIV, which you shouldn't have a stigma against that. So why so much stigma against coronavirus? But and that also plays out back in the US as well. A lot of my family members in South Carolina kind of had similar stories about, they got exposed, they got infected, they were ashamed. Nobody wanted to say that, they had COVID. So
that's amazing that we are members of the human family, and no matter where we are, we have the same kind of challenges. Give us a sense. By the way, it is really good for you to report the surveillance capability of Ghana. One of the things that continues to bedevil so many of us in the African American community is the disrespect that America has for the capabilities on the continent. And so now we've had 2 reports of excellence in terms of biosurveillance capabilities. And we just need to start thinking about our brothers and sisters on the continent in terms of what they bring to the fight, not always the deficits. But that being in mind, what are the availability, if you could tell us real quickly, of the vaccines in Ghana? Are you having a challenge with access, and are you having a challenge with infrastructure for distribute?
So early on, yes. So vaccines mostly have come through by way of donations from a lot of the developed countries. In US, we're one of the main donators through COVAX. Early on in Ghana, AstraZeneca and the Sputnik vaccine were the main 2 vaccines available. Since that time, though, the US, we've donated Moderna, Pfizer, as well as Johnson & Johnson vaccines to the government of Ghana to help fill the gap and the void in vaccine availability. And it's interesting because, Dr. Tuckton, similar enough to the US, we've seen a lot of vaccine hesitancy, some of it associated with the stigma, and some for other, just whatever reason, there's some degree of hesitancy. But again, the Ghana Health Services, their health promotions and risk communications team has been doing a very impressive job to try to combat that. And like you said, a lot of things get kind of taken for granted, like, the infrastructure is not there. It's not as robust, but what the government has been able to achieve despite the resource restraint and limited access has been pretty impressive. And of course, it's not, we're all in this fight together, as you said, but the strategy that has been in place, they've been making the most of what they've gotten. To date, I believe there have been about close to 10% of the Ghanaian population is fully vaccinated. And I think the goal is to get about 20 million of the Ghanaian populace vaccinated by the end of the year. And slowly but surely, they're slowly kind of hitting their marks. But a lot of it has just been, like you said, the availability of the vaccines, logistics and supply chain. And then once they're here, now kind of combating the hesitancy and all of the myths and dispelling, debunking a lot of the myths surrounding the vaccine.
Well, we want to really cheer you on, and we're rooting for you and your colleagues in Ghana and the Ghanaian people to reach that goal of vaccination. And I think you've made it pretty clear as well, Dr. Sanders, that the challenges from an infrastructure, a public health infrastructure system, in no way should be affecting the supply chain of vaccines from other wealthier countries into Ghana. You've got a goal to meet, and it sounds like the ability to meet it. We just need to make sure that you get what you need. And I think that's the take-home messages I hear from you. So thank you so much. And please stick around for the last panel as we introduce our next panelist, Dr. Toby Landerow. Toby Landerow of the United Kingdom is a postdoctoral research associate at the Imperial College of London, currently operating as a field-based epidemiologist as part of the Geshario project, and you're going to have to help me with that in a minute, Dr. Landio, to make sure I say that properly, but it's an important project based in Ethiopia. You are a citizen of the UK and a researcher in Ethiopia, and can you help us to understand what are the similarities and the differences between how the populations of people in the UK versus Ethiopia are responding to the pandemic? And maybe you can start with teaching me how to spell or pronounce the Geshario project.
You can help me too. I don't think anyone knows how to say it. It's pronounced Geshiaro project. Geshiaro. So it's the local dialect that means clean in the area that we work in. Yeah. Yeah, so I have quite like a unique perspective because I do work so much in Ethiopia, and obviously I'm a resident of London in the UK. And I mean, you've had guests on previously from the continent of Africa and from the United States, and the kind of it's a chasm of differences between the two countries in terms of COVID-19. I'm sure you guys have heard over in the States of kind of the success of the UK rollout of vaccines. I think we have 89% of our eligible population double vaccinated now, and 50% have also got the booster shot. So it's been kind of what the government has been holding its hat on in terms of its response to COVID. It has failed in a lot of other of its responses, but the vaccination program is something which was rolled out really quickly. Ethiopia, as of today, there's 10 million people have been vaccinated, of a country of over 250 million. That's obviously been available for the richer people who can pay for private healthcare. There isn't a national health service like there is in the UK. So in terms of actually controlling this virus and getting closer towards elimination, the UK is, leaps and bounds ahead of it.
What do you find in terms of, is it only just the availability and access in Ethiopia to those who are wealthier and have the ability to go, as you say, to private, or are there any vaccine clinics or administration sites in the Black community, the poor community?
It's very difficult. In Ethiopia, the government is voted on, and the government comes into power basically aiming their policies at people that live in Addis, people that live in the capital city. So the money stays very close. The money's very close to the capital cities or the larger cities within the country. So the vaccination program stays there too, because that's where the major economy is coming from. The Geshiaro project is a project which works on kind of trying to boost local, zonal, and district-wide healthcare proficiencies, particularly in Africa, which has relied on NGOs that come into a country, they have their money, they deliver their product, or they deliver what their objective is, their KPIs are, and they get out. When you have academic institutions going in, there's a real big emphasis on capacity building. So making sure that zonal health workers, zonal individuals, number one, understand these diseases, because a lot of these communities have lived with diseases their whole life and don't see them as a significant threat. And then number two, having the ability to study the disease, research the disease, and deliver any preventative measures they can.
Do you have reason, as you work with that project in Ethiopia, for optimism? Are you seeing that, or do you have any reason to believe that the population will be accepting vaccines once made available, or is this going to be a similar hard slog with a lot of people confronting fears, misapprehension, misinformation, and those sorts of things?
Yes and no. Ethiopia is probably one of the more culturally diverse, linguistically diverse, and interesting countries in Africa. It's the only African country that was never truly colonized. They're very proud of that fact. It's kind of a country which has been multiple tribes that have come together to form the country of Ethiopia, and there's a massive amount of devolution in terms of healthcare powers, funding powers to individual states and individual provinces. So on top of that, you have multiple cultural biases, you have multiple beliefs, you have multiple religions that enact within each one of these demographics. And that obviously is going to have a multitude of effects on trusting vaccines, trusting prophylaxis for any type of diseases.
It also sounds like a huge lift for the Ethiopian public health community. And when you've got to sort of have strategies that subdivide by that many variables, are you optimistic that they have a chance to succeed?
Yes, we're very much optimistic, because you just have to be. Otherwise you don't get more funding to do any more research. We work very closely with the Ethiopian Public Health Institute. So that's kind of the equivalent of the CDC in the States. So kind of the research and public health arm of the government. And we're very much, our kind of role is very much trying to train academics that may have degrees in Ethiopia or may have degrees from other African universities to think in a more academic way, in a more research-led way, instead of just delivering on kind of money they get from the Gates Fund, World Bank, whoever, which doesn't always progress a study or doesn't always progress research along as much as it just implements what you've been asked to do. So we're very, very, very optimistic on the researchers that we're training, that they're going to bring forward their skills and teach kind of future generations, and kind of through their own internal research, instead of collaborating so much with Western universities, they can build up the healthcare system within Ethiopia and the research there.
In 15 seconds, tell us, are you seeing more supply coming into the country from the COVAX and other large dissemination vehicles, or are you all still basically it's a very small flow, and are you concerned?
There has been an increase, mainly due to the diversity of vaccines, which actually really helps. So you, instead of just having, I think, initial ones with Johnson & Johnson, which mainly came through EU donations, and now they have Moderna, Pfizer, which is going to obviously increase the diversity of those getting the vaccines and increase the overall vaccine production.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Landrieu. This has been terrific, and we welcome you to stick around as well. As we bring in a friend of ours at the Black Coalition Against COVID and a friend of blackdoctor.org, and that's Dr. Cindy Duke. Dr. Duke has the unusual distinction of being both a virologist and an obstetrician fertility specialist. She has practices and programs in the Caribbean, including in Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Duke, welcome. And with the Caribbean being composed of countries filled with people of African descent, what are you seeing now in terms of the impact that COVID is having in the Caribbean? And you might want to be off mute.
Good morning or good afternoon. What we're seeing in the Caribbean is a mixed picture. In fact, what we're seeing in the Southern Caribbean right now is there is a crisis with COVID, particularly in my home country of Trinidad and Tobago. I speak as a proud dual citizen of Trinidad and Tobago and the United States. And Trinidad and Tobago at the beginning of the pandemic had the distinction of, shutting down early, keeping numbers at bay, keeping their case rates low. But of course, in July of this year, they actually reopened their borders, and that was actually before having high vaccination distribution rates. And so what's ended up happening is there is now a COVID crisis, in that there's a hospital bed shortage, there's a staff shortage. If you think of the smaller island, Tobago, so we're talking of a total country population of 1.2 million people. The smaller island of the two islands, because it's a two-island nation, Tobago has about 65,000 people, and they're reporting at least 145 new cases per day. And to put that into context, their hospital has less than 100 beds and less than 20 ICU beds, closer to 10 ICU beds total. So you're seeing people dying in unprecedented numbers. I myself have lost family members and extended family members over the last 6 weeks. I'm getting goosebumps, just unbelievable numbers. These are people who were otherwise healthy and predicted and projected to live long lives, who have now succumbed to COVID. And it's due to a number of factors. So in the beginning, it was due to lower vaccine distribution along socioeconomic strata. We talked about earlier whether or not racism is at play in countries with large populations of people of color. For example, in Trinidad and Tobago, greater than 90% of the population are people of color. But the truth is, while we won't call it racism, we can call it racism's post-colonial baby, which is colorism and socioeconomics is at play, combined with massive disinformation campaigns. And so we're talking about people who are very religious, who have long looked to religious authorities for guidance on decision making. We're also talking about a population that historically was 95% vaccinated when it comes to overall vaccines and immunizations historically, where now there's a huge amount of hesitancy and lots of people promoting on social media myths that are totally untrue, but hard to disprove amongst the populace.
Boy, that is tough. I'm not happy about what you've said, but I think it's important that we elevate the misery and suffering of human beings around the world. Too often, we all have a tendency to look at the world through the prism of our own individual tribes. But what you've described is just sort of breaks my heart. I wonder whether or not one would have theorized, uninformed as I am, theorized that because of the prevalence of tourism and the economics associated with getting this right, that would be an important stimulus to getting folk on the bandwagon to do whatever is necessary to keep things going. Apparently, I guess that wasn't strong enough.
It wasn't strong enough, and that's what's so sad, because these economies, Trinidad and Tobago included, are dependent on tourism. Trinidad and Tobago would argue that they're not as dependent on tourism as an economy because they're technically an oil and gas-based economy. But for example, Tobago, the smaller island, is thoroughly dependent on tourism coming from larger island and abroad. And so, yes, I think that was the driver also, because unemployment had spiked to unprecedented numbers. So that was the driver to open the borders. But I think what they hadn't anticipated, given their historic high vaccine uptake rate in the country, was the amount of hesitancy and the amount of myths being spread about the vaccines. And you name the myth that we have seen circulating in the US and other large countries, those are the same myths circulating and being actively propagated, on a daily basis. My WhatsApp is filled with people asking, is this true? Is this real? And some of it's actual stuff that we saw circulating in the US a year ago that's finally made its way there and being circulated as new information about vaccines, which is actually very incorrect. And then speaking of mistrust, so you asked earlier about mistrust regarding things like Tuskegee. What mistrust there is usually along political lines, which is historically knowing that different political groups, et cetera, may advance one thought or another based on their own political leanings and their decisions about certain populations that don't support them or not. And we're seeing that play out, sadly, in a big way. And so there are even prominent political leaders who you would argue actually have access to a lot of resources, who, because they came out initially either completely anti-vax or vaccine hesitant, even though they've made an about turn, some of them, people aren't believing. They're thinking, well, you're just trying to get votes in the next election. You knew the truth before and you told us not to take it.
Well, one thing that we know, and I'll just ask you a real quick response, is that so much of the health making, decision making for people of color all around the world come from women. It is the women who are often in charge of the health for the family. And I asked it earlier of a previous guest, but I've got to ask you, as a noted virologist and obstetrician who deals with fertility issues, so many Black women who are listening to this show, if they still need to be convinced for themselves and then for their families and particularly for their children, is there a relationship that between taking these vaccines and affecting negatively a human being's fertility?
No. So the vaccines are safe. In fact, the vaccines protect your pregnancy and they protect your overall health and therefore your overall fertility or ability to safely carry babies. If you're someone with uterus and ovaries, i.e. female or identifying as a non-binary, and if you're someone with sperm and testicles, in fact, we know that the vaccines help protect your sperm counts, but specifically, if you're not vaccinated, got COVID, got really sick, you have higher rates of erectile dysfunction and damage to the testicles. And so vaccines are protective not only for whether you're planning to have kids, maybe you're thinking, I'm done with kids, so I don't have to worry about fertility. It's still important for sexual function and longevity to protect your health.
And again, ladies and gentlemen, this is a person who is specifically trained in both virology and obstetrics fertility. So thank you so much. And we'll look forward to talking with you in just a moment as we bring our final guest in for the panels. And that's Dr. Mohammed Fadlallah. And we're really, really pleased that Dr. Fadlallah has joined us because he works with one of the most important organizations in the world today. And that's Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières. Dr. Fadlallah is an internal medicine trained physician who supplements his work at the University of Cincinnati with consistent international medical humanitarian work. He embarked on several volunteer medical missions throughout his journey, always with an eye towards global health, before finally earning a master's degree in public health with a global health concentration. And so we're really glad, Dr. Fadlallah, that you are here. Can you talk to us about, I know that you have a special interest in your native Sudan and Uzbekistan, and I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of the pandemic taking its course in the Sudan.
So thank you for having me, first of all. And I wanted to just say before I get started that I'm really blown away by the quality and the information that we're getting from all our panelists. I feel like I've learned a ton in a real 360-degree view from all these different contexts. So what I'm going to talk about is a little more specific. I'm going to talk more so from the perspective of just having worked at ground level in a couple of different contexts. Specifically, speaking about Sudan, which I spent this summer in, working in refugee camps in the east of Ethiopian refugees who were fleeing. They have a civil war going on right now in Ethiopia, and they were fleeing to Sudan. So COVID kind of descended on Sudan at a very interesting time in it politically, economically, socially. About 6 months basically before the onset of COVID, 9 months, Sudan had a 30-year dictator that was overthrown. And since that time, they've experienced a whole lot of political instability. Fast forward to kind of those first several months of COVID, and without a real strong government and apparatus, it feels like, and it is that the manifested response to this pandemic has been slowed, naturally so, in every way, in terms of supply chain, in terms of education of the public. So we're seeing problems kind of running the gamut of all the things that you would expect from lower resourced countries. And now, more specifically in my context, so despite that, we have not seen COVID really devastate the country like we've seen in other countries in terms of raw numbers. I feel like there's probably several reasons. Sudan is an incredibly rural country. Although, like the rest of the world, it is getting more and more urbanized, we still have large populations who live in rural areas, and large-scale international migration is not so much as it is in other countries. In terms of the refugee camp, there were several campaigns that were managed by the Ministry of Health trying to get the populations in the refugee camps vaccinated for COVID, but also for other things. But what you find is that if they got the first dose, the second dose kind of disappears. And we just find that there's so much start-stop, so much logistical challenges because the government organizationally is in a very precarious point that the response is very, very lacking overall.
Let me zoom in on something you just said. Dr. Fadlallah, and that is this sense of these migrants. We tend sometimes to forget about how many people are living in these migrant camps. And one of the things that I have to say that just makes me so, I don't want to be angry in life, but that makes me so despondent is we have ready access to vaccines all across the United States. It is so easy to get them, and yet so many people have chosen not to. And here you are working with people in migrant camps who have very, very little, and they clamoring for something that they just can't get. I mean,
absolutely, yeah. And the point of what you're saying is that they really want it. You know, I think that the uptake there would be a lot better than it would be in some places here. Here for me right now I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio right now, but there the uptake would be so much more apparent because I feel like it's an educated population, and I feel like it's a population that's really happy to receive whatever medical care is out there.
Wow. Well, listen, thank you for that. I want you to stay on screen, and Ellis, our producer, if you can bring back all of our guests for a sort of lightning round. And Dr. Fadlallah, let me just come back to you and just say, if you could start to think about what we might do, and I'm thinking about, for example, like medicine, Doctors Without Borders. As you think about where do you apply your shoulder to the wheel, what wheel do you push on in a country like Sudan? Where do you start? What do you see as being the things that will help us to get to a solution in your work?
So I think we, and as an organization, we kind of bang on the Ministry of Health because they seem to be the gatekeepers in terms of the distribution of our pharmacology in the country, at least what comes through our routes as MSF. So really kind of stressing to them the importance of kind of receiving and distributing the care. And then it's just very difficult right now in Sudan in particular because there's really governmental instability. The acting prime minister was imprisoned a few weeks ago and then released, and so every day is something brand new. So a couple of significant challenges, but I think as far as the population, I think they're ready and able.
Good. You know, it's amazing, an unstable political environment there, but even in a mature so-called democracy here, unstable and mixed messages, and definitely half of the folks unhelpful. Toby, if there was something that you want to leave us with that you wish you had said or that you want to reiterate that you said.
Yeah, I'd just like to go back to kind of I know I spoke a lot about Ethiopia, but talk more about the UK as a developed country and as a country which has a very prominent national health service, which is free at the point of care for every single human being in the country and those that migrate to the country. When you look at risk maps in the UK of COVID, you see that risk maps in terms of factors that affect elevated numbers of hospitalizations, elevated numbers of deaths are exactly the same for every race in the country. And it's more based on class. So you have white working class people who prominently voted Brexit, or prominently more right-wing nationalistic people being affected just as high as those from an ethnic minority background. But more and more with the vaccine hesitancy and the lack of trust of science within BAME communities in the UK, you're going to have a reservoir of infection of those in the BAME communities in the UK. And this is primarily based not on the fact that they don't want the fact that they are of a higher risk factor, but the fact that they don't have an active stakeholder in the scientific community in the UK.
Well, you know,
whereas when you look at South Asian communities, there's a lot of prominent Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi researchers in the UK, but there's a severe lack of Afro-Caribbean researchers in the UK. And this is really quite cyclical in terms of a lack of fear of the virus and a lack of acceptance of the vaccine.
Margaret, 1 minute. Things you should have said or want to repeat. Come off mute, Margaret. Still not, there you go.
There I go. So I think the thing I want to leave people with is the fact that we have to trust the science, and that's what we need to get across to everybody that we're communicating with. I mean, We've all been at this for a long time, and it's really important that they have trusted individuals telling them the truth about what can happen to them and their families. This is about legacy, and this is not just about a tipping point. This is about long lives, longevity, and continuing to make sure that we all can live together. And so it's more than just, we understand the fear, we accept the fear that they have, but they need to trust the science. We've done this for years. Everybody's been vaccinated against multiple things. And so there's nothing different. Cannot be politicized.
And Dr. Larkin's Pettigrew, that point is important not only for this moment, but for the moments down the road. Because when we come out of this, we've still got a lot of other diseases to worry about. And that distrust is going to hang with us and affect everything we do from this on. Dr. Duke, 1 minute. What do you got?
Well, I would agree with Dr. Pettigrew there, which is representation matters, and it's not just whether their skin looks like yours, but are they local to those communities? Because that's what we're seeing. And to speak specifically to our politicians, which is if you see someone spreading misinformation, even if you know that they're a big campaign supporter of yours, as Dr. Larkin Pettigrew said, we have to agree that now we have to maintain the science, uphold the science, and get the right people in place to talk about it. And if I may, to those planning vacations to the Caribbean, I'm not telling you don't go, but I'm asking you to find out what is the situation on island before you go. What is their hospital bed situation? If they don't have enough hospital beds for their locals, maybe you shouldn't potentially add to either bringing virus in, a new variant, or potentially getting sick there. Consider delaying until a later time.
Thank you so much. Keith Crawford, last word, sir, from you.
Well, again, echoing my colleagues and talking about the importance of science, I think people need to understand what good science looks like. And that's why I want to encourage you to go to the link, see the YouTube, hear my South African colleagues describe how they did the study to answer a fundamental question. They wanted to know, does convalescent plasma work? Does it help people either recuperate more quickly, or can it rescue people? We were using convalescent plasma here in the US and didn't know whether it worked. They asked a question and designed a controlled clinical study. So people need to understand what it looks like. So when you hear all this nonsense of ivermectin and the hydroxychloroquine, excellent drugs for what they were designed to do, not excellent drugs for COVID.
Thank you.
They did not undergo the rigorous research, and when they did, it was found they didn't.
Absolutely, right on the money. And Marion, it's late at night there, and you're up at all hours of the night, but please, what's your last 30-second word?
So I was going to say the same as the two ladies about the fact that, trust the science, but they've already said that. So then I had to think a little bit more. And I think what I would like is that globally, we stop discriminating against countries, low-income, middle-income countries. We stop this discrimination from the high-income countries and rather collaborate with those researchers to help to design those studies that need to be done, or whatever it is, and to help to break down those myths. I was listening to Dr. Duke, and I mean, such similarities between the Caribbean and South Africa, and a very, very religious population here. And so the myths that have been, and it is fear and lots of myths. So really just rather help the countries globally.
Thank you for your heart too. You have a beautiful heart, Marion, and that is just so wonderfully expressed. We end up on our round robin of the whirlwind Ghana. Dr. Sanders.
Well, thank you all, and not to beat a dead horse, but as the other panelists have said, just kind of trust the science, social responsibility, accountability, and as doctors, we're teachers. Doctor is a teacher, and so this. Working with our risk communications and other interagency colleagues to try to dispel some of these rumors and teach and propagate that to get that out there, to get people to trust the science. and get down to the basics.
What a way. We'll leave it right there. I love the way you ended it, Dr. Sasser. Exactly the way to take us home. Let us thank BDO for producing this event, and also Amgen for making it possible. We very much appreciate them, all of our guests. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world, let's unite as one human global family, fighting for life of every single person, every life, no matter where it is, no matter what challenges it faces, no matter how wealthy or poor, every life is important. We're joined together to try to save each and every one of them. Wear your mask, get vaccinated, practice physical distancing, and let's fight for health. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.